back to the 1800s. And thank you very much, Erica and Cora. I'm Emily Coleman Dibella, Director of Public Affairs at Mount Vernon. So I'm not a historian, but I fell in love with this story because I'm from here. I wasn't born here, but I was two when my parents, who were here, moved here. And I went to Holland Meadows Elementary and San Bergen Intermediate and West Potomac High School. So Mount Vernon's always been in my backyard. So I always sort of figured that it was a given. Of course Mount Vernon was restored and saved for generations of Americans and for visitors around the world, but actually it was very nearly not saved. And I'm here to tell you a little bit more about that story today. I hope you can see the picture pretty well. I know it's pretty light in here, but this is a picture of Mount Vernon in the 1850s. And this next picture shows it a little bit better. It was really pretty much near ruin. You can see right here, these are ship's masts that are holding up the piazza in between the columns. It was overgrown with weeds, there was chipped paint, it was really in dire straits. And John Augustine Washington III was the last of the Washington descendants who was living there at the time. He was George Washington's great-grandnephew, and just couldn't keep it up. You know, George Washington was a really innovative, passionate farmer, and I think it's a testament to his skill that his own descendants weren't able to farm the land as profitably as he was. And so the 200 acres that surround the historic mansion here were really in need of some upkeep. Mr. Washington had endeavored to sell the property to the federal government because he desired that it would be opened to the American people as a shrine, and they declined, and then he offered it to the Commonwealth of Virginia, who also declined, most likely because we were on the verge of civil war, and it was very close to the north-south border. There were some developers who offered $300,000 to purchase Mount Vernon, but thankfully John Augustine was really adamant that it be opened as a shrine and not developed for other homes or potentially as a retired soldier's home, which was one of the options. So then enters in this wonderful woman named Anne Pamela Cunningham, and she comes to us because in 1853 her mother, Louisa Bird Dalton Cunningham, was returning from Philadelphia, where she had dropped off her daughter who had been injured several years earlier and would go to Philadelphia annually to see a doctor to help her back. And so as her mother was traveling down the Potomac River, as was customary at the time, the captain tolled a bell as a sign of respect for George Washington. And the mother came up on the deck and saw Mount Vernon in the moonlight and saw what deplorable condition it was in. And she wrote her daughter an impassioned letter that said, "If the men of America cannot save this, then the women need to." Thankfully, Miss Cunningham took this as her life's mission, and she started by writing a letter in the Charleston Mercury in 1853, and was referring to Vestal Virgins and souls aflame and all sorts of Victorian language at the time, and she implored the women of America to band together to save Mount Vernon. And she signed it a Southern matron, because at that point it was scandalous if you were a woman to have your name in the newspaper unless it was announcing your marriage or your death. So,
and what year was it?
1853.
Wow.
Well, other newspapers took up the cause, started publishing this letter, and so she became a little more courageous and started actually signing her name, Anne Pamela Cunningham, to the letters. But it was really what started a nationwide effort to rescue Mount Vernon.
What did her husband do?
She was a spinster. She was not married, considered a spinster at the time, which meant she had nice time to be able to devote to this cause. The gentleman who's here is Edward Everett, who ended up being a tremendous help to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. He was a former congressman, senator, and governor of Massachusetts, and also president of Harvard. So with those credentials, you would expect he was quite a charismatic speaker. And Miss Cunningham convinced him to do a 2-hour speech on George Washington in major cities across the country and donate the proceeds towards the purchase of Mount Vernon. And he actually donated close to $70,000, which ended up being about a third of the purchase price. But obviously, they couldn't do it alone. And so Anne Pamela Cunningham started the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, where she invited each state to send one vice-regent to the association. And this is the original picture of the first one. I just love this picture because they've got these wonderful old costumes, and then right here in the middle is the Udon bust of George Washington, which we consider at Mount Vernon our most prized possession because it was made from life when George Washington was 53 and considered by his family to be the best likeness of the man. And so we sort of chuckle to see it sitting out here, you know, ready to topple off onto the piazza at any moment. Now we have it behind glass in a very state-of-the-art museum. But she started the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, and they really did this unprecedented grassroots fundraising campaign in an effort to raise $200,000 to purchase Mount Vernon. And what's so remarkable about it, not only is it the first national women's organization, but they were able to get people, newsboys from New York City, pooled their pennies and contributed $4.18. There were military outfits and fire companies that really, everyone was very much impassioned to try to save Mount Vernon, which is such a different concept for nowadays. You know, it was really quite different and really meant a lot to people. In 1856, Miss Cunningham met with John Augustine Washington III to suggest that they go forward with the purchase price, and to her surprise, he actually said he wasn't interested. He really wanted a government entity to own it, to open it up as a shrine, and modern historians think that he didn't think a bunch of women could do a good job. And so, as luck would have it, the weather turned literally, and there was a storm that came up that night. And so instead of her returning to her home, where she was going towards in South Carolina, she was encouraged to stay there to wait out the storm, and she was able to speak to Mr. Washington's wife. And again, the women rallied, and I think really must have convinced her to talk to her husband, because the next morning he acquiesced and relented and said, okay, well, if I will sign the sales agreement only if the governor of Virginia will co-sign it, and agreed to be the backup in case the association became insolvent. And so that's exactly what happened. There were several installments that were paid starting in 1858, so this year is the 150th anniversary of that sales agreement. And actually it was such a successful campaign that the Mount Vernon Ladies Association took ownership ahead of schedule in 1860, and Miss Cunningham herself moved in to personally oversee the restoration and the preservation of Mount Vernon. And this sort of comes into a new chapter of Mount Vernon, and I wanted to just briefly mention this because it's also a remarkable story. The war was breaking out, and Miss Cunningham was required to go back to her home in South Carolina to ensure its safety. And she left here to mind the shop, so to speak, Sarah Tracy from New York, who was her secretary, and a man named Upton Herbert, who was the superintendent. Now, Sarah Tracy was a very dynamic woman who, when necessary, went to both sides of the armed conflict and insisted that Mount Vernon be national neutral territory. And so, as remarkable as it may seem, Civil War soldiers would actually come during the war, put on shawls to cover up what their rankings were, and tour the house together, Southerners and Northerners. And when it became impossible to upkeep Mount Vernon, she had to start going across the lines to the district to try to sell vegetables, eggs, whatever it was that she could to make Mount Vernon continue to operate. And she had special dispensation to do that. And one day, she was stopped, and they said, nobody can override these orders unless you go to President Lincoln himself. And that's exactly what she did. She skirted the brigade there, the blockade, and went straight to the president, demanded an audience, and he said, okay, young lady, you will get your wish, and allowed her to be able to cross the lines freely, which ended up being a very good thing, because when John Augustine Washington was killed in 1861, Sarah Tracy learned that the federal government was going to seize the money that the Mount Vernon Ladies Association had paid to him as enemy property. And so she took the money, put it in her egg basket, went up to the district where she was going to go see her friend George Riggs of Riggs Bank, and while he calmly counted out some eggs, she rented a safe deposit box and put that money safely aside so that the federal government wouldn't be able to confiscate it.